Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sitara and I'm a researcher in the field of Islamic law with particular fascination with Islamic legal theory. I have recently launched this YouTube channel and put an introductory video on. You are welcome to look through that video to get a sense of why I've set up this channel and the approach I am taking. In this episode today, I'm going to set out a case for reform of Islamic intellectual thought. I think it's important that I explain how I'm using the word reform, because sometimes reform can be confused with the process of reformation that took place in European history. That was a completely different historical process. There was very much, there was a centralized authority in Christianity, which was the authority of the church. And with the Reformation, which happened in the 16th century, in effect, what was being declared was that the law of Moses or the law of Old Testament no longer applied to the Christian community. And a number of fundamental shifts happened at that time, but it is very much a European historical process. We do not have a parallel of that nature in Islam, simply because Islam has never had a highly centralized authority, which would even issue a formal statement of creed or a formal statement of belief. And the way Islamic law is experienced is very, very different from the Christian experience of Christianity and its rules and regulations. So when I am using the word reform, I am using it within the context of Islamic intellectual thought. So reform for us is the idea that we look at the canonical sources of Islam, the Quran, the Hadith, and the Islamic legal tradition. And we learn from that, we take inspiration from that, but we also make changes to our methods and approaches so they become fit for purpose for our modern living in the 21st century. That, in a nutshell, is what I mean by reform. Let me just put on a slide for you. I have 3 or 4 slides. This is not a lecture. I don't want this to be a lecture. This is very much, an informal talk. But the reason why I've put the slides together is just to give coherence to the points I'm making today. But also, I've put examples on the slides to aid your memory of this talk as well. So let me just put those on, and hopefully the technology would work. So you should now be able to see the title slide, A Case for Reform of Islamic Intellectual Thought. Let me move on first to try to encapsulate with this image the experience of being Muslim, and particularly the experience of engaging with our intellectual thought or developing our intellectual thought. I think sometimes the experiential is consigned to the margins, such as our tendency to approach the Quran and the books of Hadith as books of rules. But it feels that we are a bit stuck. As a community, we feel stuck. And I think this image is appropriate in explaining what that feeling is. So not only do we have these obstacles in our path, all of these rocks which are stopping us from moving, we're also not able to stand upright because of what I call the sack of guilt, which is on our backs all the time. And unfortunately, many Muslim scholars and preachers and very popular personalities on YouTube, because they have this very binary halal, haram, yes, no approach to religion, they have ended up giving us this sack of guilt. So we carry this rock on our backs all the time. And it can take different forms. There could be different rulings that affect that and bring that experience to us. For instance, just a couple of days ago, I was looking at a video clip from a very, very famous preacher who is an orator, who is a scholar of comparative religion and uses comparative religion to do da'wah, to invite people to Islam. And he said that it is not permissible for Muslims to live in the West. Now, here is a fatwa that has been given out. So all of the millions of Muslims who are living in the West now have this sack of guilt on their back. I think women tend to perhaps carry a bigger sack of guilt because we are told every day how to dress, that our hair should not show. We're worried about wearing nail polish. Would that affect our ablutions? Would we be able to say our prayer? Men, of course, are put under pressure around, the length of the beard and how it should be trimmed, and that they need to fold up their trousers above their ankles before they enter the mosque. So taking out a loan to buy a house, for example, expanding a business. With every matter, which is a very practical daily matter, we end up getting a ruling which puts this sack of guilt on us. Now, please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that Muslims do not have accountability towards God, or that there isn't a moral framework within which we need to live our lives. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there is this disproportionate focus on halal and haram binaries, and the category of haram has been expanded so much that it has ended up putting the sack of guilt on our backs. So really we feel crushed. We can't move forward because there are all of these rocks in front of us, and we can't stand upright and breathe fully either because we carry the sack of guilt. How have we ended up here, and what are the errors we have made in approaching the Quran and Hadith, the canonical sources of Islam, because of which we have ended up here? So this is to do with our approach. The Quran is the book of God. It is the source of truth. It is the source of guidance, of moral guidance and inspiration. We do not challenge the truth of the Quran. The Hadith is an important historical piece of information for us, which gives us the memory of the Prophet, and it tells us, again, very, very amazing things about morality, about ethics, about the Prophet's approach to solving really complex issues. But how are we approaching these sources? What errors have we made which have ended up paralyzing us almost in this position? And that's what I'm going to focus on. Now, I am going to be skimming over quite a lot. I acknowledge that there's quite a lot I'm covering. I'm giving you a synoptic view. But please rest assured, I will be building on each of these points in detail through my further series of videos. So for example, if I mention the hijab, I will be recording a series of videos just discussing the hijab in detail. So today I'm just going to give you a synoptic view, just skim over those issues just to get a sense of what those issues are, and then build on those later. So this is my diagnosis of the problem. Other reformist scholars or other traditional scholars might completely disagree with it. This is what I've encountered when I have done my research. So I'm giving you my view of what I think the issues are. And there are two issues which I think perhaps have the most consequential impact. One is an ahistoric approach to how we interpret our sources, and an ahistoric approach towards classical law. So classical law of Islam was formulated between the 3rd and the 5th centuries of Islam. And we have the 4 great Imams in the Sunni tradition. We have Imam Jafar Sadiq in the Shia tradition. You will be familiar with that. That kind of legal theory became matured during that era. And again, we have an ahistoric approach to that, and I will explain what that means. And the second issue, which I'll come to in a moment, is how we approach Hadith and the errors we've made there. But let's look at ahistoricism in general. When I say ahistoric, the definition of ahistoric is simply either we ignore history, or we feel that it's not related to us, or we just dismiss it. So a historic approach is an approach where you try to understand the past very much on its own terms, that you take the historical context into view, you look at the socioeconomic conditions in a society, you look at the customs, the urf in that society, you understand how people live, what cultures and what values were important for them. If those are dismissed and set to one side, then our approach becomes ahistoric. One of the assumptions we've made here, and often still tend to make in traditional circles, is pretty much summed up as the Quran was revealed in a vacuum. And it's almost as if it never addressed its immediate reality. Now, this is quite a complex issue because it comes into tension with this idea that the Quran is transcendental, that the revelation is applicable to us for all times, that this revelation will continue to guide future generations of Muslims. Nobody disagrees with that. Reformist scholars also do not disagree with that. But if we fix the text of the Quran in such a way that it removes its link with its immediate reality, then we're doing a disservice to the Quran. Because the fact is, if you open up the Quran and you read it, you are immediately confronted with history. The Quran is talking to its immediate addresses. The Quran is talking about earlier nations. The Quran is actually even inspiring the Prophet to give specific responses to specific situations. The Quran is referring to rules and regulations and customs that were prevalent in 7th century Hijaz. So the Quran Quran very much gives you that sense of history. But if we take the text of the Quran and the meaning of that text and detach it from that history, we encounter a problem. For example, if the word qawam is used in the Quran in Surah Nisa, and it meant something in terms of men being the protectors of women or in charge of women, does the word qawam still mean the same thing as it meant in 7th century Hijaz? We can't therefore approach the Quran as if it was revealed in a vacuum. Now, I know that there is a fear amongst traditional scholars that if we start historicizing the Quran, it's going to become an outdated Quran. In other words, people will end up making the case that the Quran could only talk to a 7th century reality and cannot talk to later realities. That is not true. What I have found through my research is that when we contextualize the Quran properly, it becomes alive, it becomes more dynamic. Now, there is an excellent book on this by Kenneth Cragg. It's called The Event of the Quran. And it's written in a beautiful, the language of the book itself is just beautiful. It is a joy reading it. But there are some really interesting things that Kenneth Cragg brings to our attention. One of which is he says that the Quran's revelation itself is an event. It's a historical event. Hence, he says the event of the Quran. On page 16, he says, by this deliberate focus on the Quran in its time and place, we no doubt incur a suspicion, which it will be well to discount in advance. It is that a firm emphasis on 7th century actuality, as the book reveals it, implies some intended consignment of the scripture to that distant past. Nothing, in fact, is further from the mind of these pages. The deep relevance of the Quran to contemporary man is the more eloquent for being rooted in contemporary realities as they were to the Prophet. Our purpose is to take the measure in its own context of a phenomenon which bears urgently upon our own age, but which can only address us in the authenticity of its original quality. So the Quran was not revealed in a vacuum. The Quran gives us transcendental principles. It gives us a trajectory to follow, but it also, the amazing book that it is, it also deals with the immediate reality confronting the Prophet of Islam. The second point around being ahistoric, our traditional approach is very idealistic, and it also idealizes. It idealizes the past. So because it idealizes the past, it tends to be backward looking. It's always looking back. It's always looking back to the golden era, the classical age of Islam, the great era of Islam. It can never be replicated. The earliest generations of Islam understood the Quran the best. Yes, they did for their reality. Now, idealization is a concept that my research supervisor, Dr. Mustafa Sheikh, drew my attention to. And when I was doing my doctoral research, I came across this sentence which encapsulates this tendency towards idealization. This is by Mufti Taqi Usmani, and he writes in his book, Introduction to Islamic Finance, he says the real and ideal instruments of financing in the Sharia are musharaka and mudaraba. Now look what happens when we read this sentence. We feel that the real and ideal way in which we can do trade and finance is the way the Arabs used to do trade and finance in the 7th century, 1400 years ago. This idealization roots us and fixes us in a past that no longer applies, and a past that we cannot recreate. Islamic finance has tried to recreate it, and I'm afraid it hasn't met success. It has had to move away from musharaka and mudaraba, which, by the way, look like very technical terms, but it means one investor giving money to another, a traveling merchant who would take the money or goods from the Hijaz, from Makkah, and travel north to Syria and surrounding areas, sell those goods there, bring the profit back, and share it with the investor. It was a form of long-distance trade. But to say that it's the ideal instrument of financing in the Sharia means that we're now fixing ourselves to that ideal instrument. Whether that applies today or not is a separate matter. This idealization is one of the reasons why when people talk about that golden past, the first thought in our head is, I'm not sure it applies. I don't know how to make sense of it. I don't know how to relate to it. Another problem with the ahistoric approach is what I call pre-modern paradigms of mazhabs. Now, mazhabs or masalik, as we know of them, are in the schools of thought, the legal schools of thought in Sunni and Shia Islam. And when I say Sunni and Shia Islam, I don't mean two Islams, but the legal thoughts, the legal schools within those two strands. And the paradigm is a lens. When you think about a lens, think about, if you wear your sunglasses, think about how the lens gives you some tints, right? So paradigm are lenses. It's the way in which we look at the world. And the paradigm of our mazhabs are pre-modern, right? So they talk to a pre-modern reality. An example of that is when they talk about marriage, they talk about marriage as a contract of protection. They talk about marriage purely as a legal contract. When we now think of marriage, we have the romantic notions of marriage. We think about mental compatibility, and we think about value compatibility, and we think about shared interests. I married this man because he reads the same books that I read. So this is a very different conceptualization of marriage. Yet our mazhab-based discussions are not able to accommodate that conceptualization because they are pre-modern in their paradigms. And finally, one of the consequences of using an ahistoric approach is that we create a false past. Now, I've given an example here, this image of a lady who's clad in black. This you will find on the internet floating around a lot on social media. Now, a very well-intentioned Muslim man, I don't know who he is, but he has gone into a text written by Sheikh Albani, and he's tried to give a visual representation to what he thinks is Sheikh Albani's view. It may not be his view. I'm just talking about this picture which is floating about on social media. And you will see that it brings some religious normativities in as well. They must cover the body, it's not an adornment, it should be thick, it should not be transparent, etc. Now, this is projected as the ideal attire for a Muslim woman. And often with these photos, what you'll get is a bit of text that says this is how Muslim women used to dress, and now Muslim women are not as pious and therefore they stopped dressing like that. This is a false past, an imagined past. If you really want to learn about how women used to dress at the time of Prophet Muhammad, I would strongly suggest a series of lectures on hijab by Dr. Khalid Abul Fadl. That's 5 hours of investment of your time, but it will give you a very good sense of how women used to dress and what issues of modesty were coming up at that time. Okay, so this is me summing up the consequences of having an ahistoric approach. The second obstacle in our path is the Hadith and Sunnah equivalence. Now, this is quite a complex area. I'm going to devote a number of episodes to this later on. And the reason why it's also complex is because this is where we need to unlearn some of our learning. And unlearning is not an easy process, neither is it a comfortable process. But we have been taught that Hadith and Sunnah are one and the same thing. Hadith is Sunnah, Sunnah is Hadith, Sunnah is found in Hadith. This is a source error. And it's a source error because Hadith and Sunnah are two completely different things. Hadith are oral reports which later became written reports. They are the historical memory of the Prophet, and they are historical memory of how the Prophet applied certain laws and rulings of the Quran. It is a vast corpus, and it has got some reports in it which are authentic and some other reports which are not authentic, and it needs a level of expertise and methodological expertise to be able to approach Hadith. Sunnah, on the other hand, is what we call normative practice. It is the practice of being Muslim, the Islamic way of life. So think about saying your prayer, for example, saying your namaz, that is Sunnah. And you do not get knowledge of the Sunnah from Hadith. You get knowledge of namaz from watching your parents pray. So you would have seen photos where, mom or dad are praying and there's a toddler sitting next to them, and the toddler is mimicking the actions of mom and dad, even though he can't, or he or she can't say the words, but they're mimicking the actions. And then as they get older, parents actually teach them how to do their namaz. And so we learn to pray, and we learn to fast, and we learn to do our ablutions, and we learn to do our ghusl, our bathing, all of the rules around cleanliness, menstruation, etc. We learn that from our parents. We do not learn that from books of Hadith. So Sunnah is practice. Sunnah is doing things which are Islamic, doing things which we've been asked to do by the Prophet, been propagated by the Prophet, and the knowledge of which has transferred from one generation to another. Okay, if we try to contain Sunnah into Hadith, and Hadith will have information about the Sunnah, but if we try to anchor the Sunnah in the Hadith itself, what happens is that it becomes ossified. Now, this has happened with our law and our tafsir. Okay, so most of fiqh or Islamic Islamic law, Islamic fiqh, is actually hadith based. And if we look at the history of how the tafsir sciences developed, the explanation of the Quran sciences, the exegesis, you will find that even in the field of exegesis, it turned towards using hadith to explain the Quran. Now, when law and tafsir both become grounded in hadith, they become ossified. Ossification is a biological term. It's a term from biology. It means when soft tissue settles into bone and becomes rigid. So the same process happens. An example of that is, in Saudi Arabia, we had this rule for a long time, a law that women can't travel without a mahram. Now, the Prophet would have given this recommendation according to his circumstances. It's a commonsensical recommendation, it's a good recommendation, and it still applies in certain areas, like in remote areas in Pakistan, where it is not safe for women to travel alone. But when you say that it is a matter of law and transcendental law, then what you do is you take that law from its original setting, you apply it in the 20th and 21st century, and you put a driving ban on women. That is called ossification. Okay, that ossification is one of the key obstacles in us moving forward. I have a few further examples. Now, these categories will overlap, okay? These are not mutually exclusive categories. They will overlap. So some examples can fit in other categories, but in each case, I've tried to explain what I mean. An atomistic approach to understanding the Quran. Atomistic is a word Fazlur Rahman uses, great thinker of Islam. He passed away in the 1980s. And he says that we have this tradition of verse by verse translation, verse by verse tafsir, verse by verse understanding of the Quran. And even when we approach matters of law, we use the same approach. It's atomistic, it's disparate, it's broken up. And we don't see the Quran as a coherent whole with its own coherent moral framework. Now, because we don't see that coherence, we detach things from the context. And in fact, we detach verses even from the internal context of the Quran, the internal linguistic linkages in the Quran, which are actually really fascinating, really important. And at some point, I will be doing a discussion on the coherence of the Quran. But I'll give you two examples. One is polygamy, which we have lifted from an excerpt in Surah Nisa in verse 3. We've lifted an excerpt from that verse, detached it from the rest of the verse, and created what is now seen as a right of a Muslim man to marry up to 4 wives. Okay, it has been turned into a right, what was in fact an allowance made in response to a specific situation, which was that in the Battle of Uhud, which Muslims lost, more than 70 companions of the Prophet passed away. Now, in a small community, 70 men dying is a massive tragedy with profound consequences for the families who were linked to those martyrs, okay, their wives, their children. And so the Quran is responding to, is using an existing practice in Arabian society, which was polygamy. It was extant before Islam was revealed, and it is using that to address what is a crisis, a social crisis. But when we lift it from its context, rather than this being an allowance in a particular situation, it becomes a right. So suddenly we're legislating that it is the right of a man to marry up to 4 times. Look at Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 33. There's an excerpt in that verse that says that women should stay in their homes. And that's used all the time to say that a woman's place is her home and she should stay at home and she should just look after the family. And why does she need to step out? And this comes up again and again when women demand the right to study, to work. And what is interesting is that if you just go back to verse 28, you'll see that that paragraph in the Quran starts from addressing the Prophet's wives, O wives of the Prophet. And verse 32, just preceding verse 33, says that the Prophet's wives are not like other women. So the Quran is already telling us that this is a specific ruling, khas. It's a specific ruling for the wives of the Prophet. Why? Because they're not like other women. They have a different station, a different status, a different role to play than other women. Then it says that you should stay in your homes. Yet we take it out, because we have this atomistic approach, we take it out from the narrative of the Quran, and suddenly it turns into this understanding, this legal understanding that women should stay in their house. And we're seeing the consequences of that and the abuses of that. Look what's happening in Afghanistan, for example, where women's basic rights are being taken away from them. The next obstacle in our path is legalistic thinking. I like to call it the legal Muslim, and I will do an episode on the legal Muslim, which is this idea in Islamic fiqh that men and women are basically just only concerned with laws. We're only concerned with do's and don'ts, yes and no, halal, haram. And so when we approach the Quran, we approach it as a book of rules. We approach the Hadith as a book of rules, right? And because we approach it as a book of rules, we forget that most of the Quran is morality and ethics. And that in the Hadith, there is a lot of discussion on morality and ethics. And actually, Hadith is really useful in mining the hikmah or the wisdom behind Quranic rulings as well, because the Prophet explains those things to us, but we approach them as book of rules. Now, I'll give you an example of what that legalistic thinking does, right? It's very reductionist. So it reduces things down just to legalities. So you will often hear that Islamic banking is interest-free. This is an interpretation of some verses in Surah Al-Baqarah. And it is on this interpretation that Islamic banking and finance has been established as an industry, that Islamic banking is interest-free. You know, this is what makes it distinctive. But if you read the Quran, the Quran's concern throughout is with oppression through debt. So people who have more money use lending practices to oppress people who are in difficult situations. So the question is, if I only take a legalistic approach here, what is happening is that I'm missing the Quran's hikmah or the moral wisdom behind this ruling, which is to reduce oppression. Now, if I bring that back into the thinking on Islamic finance, if I bring the concern for oppression back into the discussion, suddenly who becomes visible to me? The bonded laborers of South Asia. 18 million workers who are still in bonded labor, and their children are born as slaves. Yet all of Islamic finance and banking literature makes no mention of them. Why? Because that legalistic reductionism just makes them focus on one thing, that Islamic banking should be interest-free. Another problem we have is text literalism. This is where we look at some text from the Quran or Hadith, and either we say that the meaning of the text will remain the same as it was in the 7th century when the Quran was revealed, or we say that the meaning of the text will not be, that we will not be able to find any other significance to that text. So I'll give you an example in terms of miswak. So when we become literalist about miswak, we go around telling people it is sunnah to do miswak, whether we want to use miswak or not. Miswak, by the way, is the practice of using the bark of a tree to clean your teeth. And miswak was had antibacterial properties. The Prophet used it. Well, now we know it had antibacterial properties, but the Prophet used it to clean his teeth. The point is, in this report about using miswak, is the emphasis on using miswak, or is the emphasis on oral hygiene? If we become literalists and we say the emphasis is on using miswak and miswak alone, then we're missing the point on oral hygiene. So either we say that the word will have the same meaning, so kawam, for example, the meaning cannot shift, or we say that we stick to the literalist interpretation and don't look at the moral grounding behind it. Another example is turning up trousers above the ankles. Such an issue. I mean, men talk about this all the time, about, you know, you have to turn up your trousers, your ankles should show when you're saying your prayer. And this comes from a hadith narration that some people used to walk in Makkah and Medina with their garments hanging behind them and trailing on the ground. That was a sign of arrogance, people flaunting their wealth to say, look, I'm so rich, that I can buy this expensive cloth and have it drag behind me. Okay, actually we see that practice with where people wear a long train. We see that in royal weddings in Britain as well, where women wear this long train which somebody else carries for them. This is a sign of status, and the Prophet was actually saying, don't do that, lift this above your ankles. So don't be arrogant in the way you walk. Don't make status and your wealth so ostentatious. Don't make an open display of it. We have turned that into a ruling on turning up your trousers. Why? Because again, the hikmah, the moral principle behind that ruling has been lost. So text literalism is a problem. The next obstacle is kind of our clinging to dogma. this idea of devotional practice, spending too much energy on devotional practice, and lack of criticality. So there are some persistently negative views of women which are not being challenged openly, certainly not in our traditional circles. We sometimes do certain acts which are acts of devotion, but we think that there is some reward in the hereafter attached to them. So one of the examples is eating dates. We say that eating dates is sunnah. Eating dates is not sunnah. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was eating dates because dates and goat's milk were one of the key sources of nutrition in the area where he lived. We can do a little thought experiment and say that if the Prophet was born in Malaysia, he would be eating pineapples. Eating pineapples would not become sunnah because pineapples are simply the fruit available in his locality where he lives. And then there's lack of criticality, where we shut down questions. So any controversial questions, if our children want to talk about atheism, if they want to talk about other religions, if they want to talk about why the Prophet married Aisha when she was so young, if they want to discuss apostasy, if they want to talk about, sectarian differences, we just shut the questions down. This means that from a young age, we're training our children not to ask questions and not to take a critically engaged approach to religion, but a dogmatic approach to religion. And we can see the serious consequences that result from that. Another issue with Islamic intellectual thought, traditional thought, is that the voices of women and children are completely missing. So that's the perspective of one half of the faith community is completely missing from our legal processes, from our ijtihad. An example of that is the socially distanced male prayer. So when COVID happened and mosques were closed, even here in Britain when mosques were closed, nobody had access. When mosques started to reopen, you had to make sure that you were meeting social distancing rules. And the moment those social distancing rules came in, women were expelled from the mosques. So the idea was that male prayer is more important than female congregational prayer. Even for Eid, we had instances where mosques were doing up to 4 Eid congregations, but they were all for men because they will only accommodate men. Okay, so the voices and the presence of women is completely missing when we are writing our fatwas on halal and haram and various other issues. And the final point that I want to make in terms of the obstacles that stand in our way is what I call the lack of duty of care. Now, in Islamic legal theory, there is a principle called maslaha, or public welfare, where when you are writing a ruling, you do take public welfare into account. It is a controversial area. It's not a very highly developed area. I think reformist scholars are now doing more work on that. But let's make it simpler and just call it duty of care. When we are writing all of these fatwas, why are we not looking at the impact of those fatwas and the consequences that they're going to have? Now, in Britain, there is a very good practice, which is that when the government proposes something new, a new set of legislation or a new policy, it has to complete an impact assessment. Now, an impact assessment will tell you if, for example, you make changes to the student loan system, what impact is it going to have on women? The recent changes are regressive, for example. What impact is it going to have on children from low-income households? Again, changes are regressive. So there's an impact assessment. We do not have impact assessment as a feature of our legal thinking, our legal reasoning, okay? And it needs to be. I'm arguing for impact assessments to be made mandatory in any process of ijtihad. And I'll give you the examples of the consequences this creates, right? So there is a very prominent traditional alim, a traditional scholar in Pakistan, very well respected person, hugely influential. And when COVID was at its height in Pakistan and people were talking about closing down mosques, he was arguing persuasively that mosques should be kept open. Why? Because he'd adopted a dogmatic position, which was that mosques never close. And it's interesting, at that time, Saudi Arabia had made the decision to close the 2 sacred mosques, in Makkah and Medina. But the scholar in Pakistan was insistent that mosques should remain open. Now look at the impact of that fatwa in a country where there is no proper public funded healthcare, where the population is already malnourished, a lot of people does not have access to good health, good hygiene facilities. Keeping mosques open would definitely have led to some unnecessary deaths. But where was the impact assessment? There wasn't any. In 2015, I think 7 or 8 years ago, Pakistani government legislated that nobody could eat in public during Ramadan. Look at the harshness of that. What about women who are pregnant or breastfeeding? What about women who are menstruating? What about people who are diabetic? What about religious minorities who do not fast and who have the right not to fast? They're not Muslims. It's not incumbent on them to fast. What about elderly people who need their hydration and their nutrition on time? Again, no impact assessment. And related to that is the issue of marathon fasting, where our ulama are insisting that Muslims who live in northern climes, in areas like Britain or further up north, that they should be doing the fasts at the sunset and sunrise, and they're forcing people to do these marathon fasts. Some people in Sweden are fasting 22 hours a day in the summer fast, and that has a huge toll on their routine, on their health, and yet there is an insistence that fasting must be done that way. So there is a lack of duty of care in our traditional processes of legal reasoning. And it is these things that reformist scholars are trying to address. Certainly these things factor in my thinking when I look at matters of law. And inshallah, in the next episode, I'm going to set out some of the approaches that reformist scholars are using. But I do hope that this diagnosis of the problem has been really helpful to you in trying to understand the reasons why we're feeling so stuck at times as a community, and why we are in the middle of this intellectual crisis. I hope that by diagnosing the problem and articulating the problem, we can also start finding a way forward. So again, going back to my introductory video, I am trying to create that space for empowerment again. I hope you've found this useful. If you have, please do subscribe to my channel. This is how you're encouraging me to keep going. Do give your comments as well at the bottom, and I will do a description of this video, so please feel free to add comments there, and also do share it with your family and friends as well if you feel that this can benefit other people in your social circle. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.